All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The 4 Imperatives for Sales Enablement in 2020 and Beyond. My name is Steve Jones, Vice President of Marketing here at Corporate Visions, and I'll be moderating today's event. But before I get started, I want to do a few housekeeping items so we can make today's event as interactive as possible for everybody. You've joined the presentation using your computer's speakers by default. If you'd prefer to join over the telephone, just go ahead and select phone call in the audio pane, and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll also have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the question pane on the control panel. Feel free to send in your questions at any time during today's event, and we'll collect those and answer as many as we can throughout today's presentation. Also, as a reminder, following the event, we'll be sending all attendees a recording of today's webinar along with the slides within the next 24 hours or so. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. First, our very special guest, John Pereira, Chief Marketing Officer of HighSpot, a leader in the sales enablement tools and software space, and Eric Peterson, Chief Executive Officer here at Corporate Visions and co-author of the soon-to-be-released book, The Expansion Sale. John, I believe you're going to go ahead and kick things off for us today, so please let me turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Good afternoon. It is a delight to join Corporate Visions. Really thrilled to be here. Just by means of personal introduction, I run marketing for HighSpot. Previously spent 7 years at Adobe, and before that, I spent 18 years at Microsoft. HighSpot, by the way, we are in a category called Sales Enablement, and we wake up every single morning thinking about how do we help sellers achieve and exceed their quota. How do we help sales managers and sales teams make sure that all of their customer-facing personnel are trusted advisors? Customers we have include DuPont, SAP, Red Hat, John Deere, and more. And our platform is, if you were to rethink and reimagine SharePoint in the cloud with one purpose in life, which was to use AI so that sellers could find the content they needed at the moment of action, that's what we do. And as part of our work, we've been working with Corporate Visions around how do we marry the best of technology and cloud AI to the best of research and amazing thinking and methodology. And so I'm really delighted to be here with Eric. Eric, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, John. So I'm Eric Peterson, CEO of Corporate Visions. If you guys aren't familiar with us, companies come to us when they are looking to take this complex message that they have to take to market, simplify it without dumbing it down, differentiate themselves from their competition in a way that customers actually care, and then use all the tools available when it's marketing or salespeople to deliver that message in a way that's so compelling and memorable that even if your customer doesn't make a buying decision for a week or a month or a year after you talk to them, they still remember why they need to choose you. And so we work with the largest companies in the world. We have the privilege of doing the workshops all over the world. We did it in 56 countries this year, over 35,000 people trained. And I'm excited to get the opportunity to talk with John around what are the big trends that we're seeing in the market, and then also how to think about potentially addressing those trends in the world of sales enablement. I'd also want to share one other thing that I think is unique about our organization, which is I'm not going to be sharing necessarily best practices with you guys around how you might address the challenge at hand, because we don't go out and survey our customers and then say, hey, based on these surveys, here's what you need to do. Instead, we take a different approach, and that is by partnering with research scientists around the world. So as you hear me talking today and we have this discussion back and forth, know that a lot of what I'll be sharing is informed by studies done by two gentlemen in particular. One is Dr. Zach Tormala. Dr. Tormala is a social psychologist, and he's a professor at Stanford University. And with him, we've done dozens of studies on how people frame value and make choices, and then what you as a sales or marketing person need to do in order to impact that decision making. The other person on here is Dr. Nick Lee. He is also a social psychologist as well as a cognitive neuroscientist. He's currently teaching at Warwick University in London, and he also has been a part of these studies, helping us shape them so that we can come to the world with informed opinions on what actually can work when you're trying to persuade someone to make a decision for you. So when you hear me referring to the studies, these are studies that we funded with these two gentlemen. But the first thing you have to do is have something relevant and interesting to take and get studied. And so that's what the 4 trends are that John and I are going to discuss and also get some of your input and thoughts on over the course of this webinar. The first one is this idea that customer success is emerging as a growth engine. And this is something that that we're seeing. Now you'll see growth engine with a question mark there, because I'll share from our opinion, while we see customer success emerging as a big and important thing in a lot of organizations, what's unclear is how good a job customer success is doing of actually increasing value to the customer that then results in value to their own organization. And that's something we've been looking at for the last couple of years. It's something we're going to continue to look at. But this is a place where when we think about sales enablement, we think there's the opportunity to expand your charter, to move beyond just training your salespeople, but also training some of your CS people. And so before getting into that, though, what we would like to do is just get a poll to get a sense of the people who are online right now, what your current environment looks like. And the poll question is, does your organization have a dedicated customer success team? So please reply to that. And while they do, I want to spin things over to John first to what are your thoughts on how customer success is working at actually bringing value to organizations and actually helping with retention and expansion?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. I know this from firsthand experience, as well as what we're seeing with our customers and data across the industry. When I was at Adobe, I actually ran the sales team, the engineering team, and our customer success team. And it became really clear to us. And by the way, we were one of the very first customers of Gainsight as part of that. And I got to know Nick Mehta and other people that you've been working very closely with. And it became very clear that, you know, we used to say it was the job of the salesperson to be the trusted advisor to the customer. But once you have that customer, it becomes the job of the customer success person to be a trusted advisor. It can't be somebody who says, pay us more money. It has to be somebody who's giving more value. Interesting data point just came out earlier this week. Jason Lemkin writes really well for SaaStr, and he did an analysis of Salesforce's revenue. And what they found is that 3/4 of Salesforce's incremental revenue in fiscal 19 came from their installed base. And so what that means to me is that if companies aren't thinking about how to make customer success a source of competitive advantage, oh, by the way, I do have a fire truck outside, and that's how you know that this is a real live webinar, and I'm okay. 3/4 of Salesforce revenue is coming from their installed base. That means customer success has to be providing that value. And so you need the platform so that they can find the information they need to have value-added conversations, and you need the methodology and frameworks behind it. And so I'll share one more data point and hand it back to you. We just did a survey of sales enablement professionals around the world, and we asked them, how do you guys track and measure success? And in particular, what are some of the success metrics that are on your scorecard? We were surprised to see that 30% of respondents have got net promoter score, net favorability, or customer satisfaction metrics at the very core. So I think what you're onto here is that for companies to grow, you have to delight your customer base and empower the customer success teams that are having those conversations.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with all that. I'd say there's another thing that has been interesting about what we've learned over the last, it's really been 3 years of studies. We've put about 6,000 participants through those studies to try and get at the heart of what is the way you should communicate value to a customer, right? So if I was to look at some of the biggest challenges that exist today with customer success organizations, I'd say they're so focused on delighting customers that sometimes what gets lost is that a delighted customer doesn't always stick with you. And so I just want to bring up a tweet that I saw recently, and this is from Nick Mehta, a gentleman you just mentioned, and I know that you know. He's the CEO of Gainsight, this company that's done a wonderful job on building a community around customer success, while at the same time building a software platform. And he recently shared this tweet that he called a poignant quote from a customer success executive at a public company today. And that's that in competitive industries, which my guess is most people who are listening to this live and work in a competitive industries, renewals are really resells. And that's, to me, fascinating when you think about the core charter of customer success. The idea and the hope was that you could get these customers on board, you could acquire them through whatever is your acquisition framework for bringing new customers to your company. And then if you just provided them with great service, well, they would stick with you. And frankly, is sales even important in that mix anymore, right? If you're just providing such great service. But so far, what you see out there is it actually isn't enough just to provide great service. And this is where Nick says this is why sales training is becoming increasingly important for CS teams. Now, what I would say to that, Nick's a good friend, and I broadly agree with him on this. But what I would say is that if it really is, if you're talking about a true customer success team, if you go to them and say, hey, you know what you guys need is sales training, my experience and our experience is customer success people will balk at that. Because back to your idea, John, that they're supposed to be trusted advisors, they feel like, no, I'm the person you trust in this relationship, right? I'm not trying to sell you something. And so what I would say needs to change, though, is they do need training, but rather than calling it sales training because it's so objectionable to them, it's really training on how to communicate value. And what I would say is that the average customer success organization is so focused on things like adoption, utilization, presenting reports, fixing problems, that often the thing that doesn't happen with them is this value communication. And this, to us, is where sales enablement really can help. You don't have to say you're selling, but they ought to have frameworks for how to communicate value more effectively.
And Eric,
thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I remember a famous guy from Microsoft I used to work with who said, if you're not communicating the value of your solution on an ongoing basis to your existing customer, then your competitor is reframing it for you. And that just always stuck with me. And so this point that it's not about selling, but communicating, telling the story of value in a way that's resonant and that helps the person you're talking to communicate that to an executive stakeholder, that's a skill. That's a framework. We absolutely support that.
Yeah. And so what I want to do is just briefly touch on, so following this, there's going to be an opportunity to download an ebook that'll go deeper into all these things. So I don't want to just surface up a challenge without talking about this, how you might be able to solve for it. One of the things that's interesting when you start to, as a sales enablement person, think about, well, how am I going to help these people think about communicating value, is that a lot of people look to the model they already have in place on the customer acquisition side. And from that, from a messaging standpoint, has all been about what I would describe as like provocative, insight-based selling, right? That's been the model on the customer acquisition side. And when people look on the expansion side, often they think, well, if this worked here, then shouldn't it work over here? And that's where we went to work and did some studies to figure out, is that actually the case? Is that provocative, insight-driven message the right one to take to customers when they're already customers, right? So it certainly works great when you're trying to get a new logo, but does it work on this right-hand side when you're trying to retain and expand? And what our research showed is that, in fact, it doesn't work. And the reason why is because of something called status quo bias. Status quo bias is real, and it's not your friend. Not when you're trying to secure a new logo. It is your friend, though, when you're trying to expand an existing customer. And so what that means from a messaging standpoint is where over here on the customer expansion side, you're trying to disrupt and defeat the status quo. When you're on the customer expansion side, actually what you're trying to do is reinforce the status quo. And it's been interesting over the last couple of years figuring out what that actually means. I won't get into all of it right now, but think of it as almost the exact opposite. Rather than being super disruptive and telling them all the reasons they want to change, what you actually need to do is take a different message to them in a different framework. And what we've seen is it improves renewal rates, retention, and expansion rates double digit if you just realize there's two different motions. But again, at the end of the day, it's all about helping the people who are talking to customers the most, those CS, customer success managers that are out there, to communicate value. And I guess
Eric,
yes. Yep.
A question for you on this one that I know we discuss a lot at our company and our customers, and many people on this call have, on the webinar likely have. One of the challenges is that the person who bought your solution, your champion, the person who's implementing it, who's running it day in, day out, a year or two down the road, they go off to a different department, they go to a different company altogether. And so end up with a new person that you have to reinforce and communicate that value with. And it's almost like you have to resell. Was there any research that came up or some of your frameworks that address that issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm just going to move quickly to a slide that can speak to that. What we found in terms of frameworks that work, and there's really two different ones that you're trying to address. One is when you're in the retention, the framework that works from that, and I won't have a chance to go through all of this because we've got other topics we certainly want to hit, but from a retention standpoint, it's actually following this model that's a why stay model. And what you'd hear from us is our recommendation is this model at the top is actually the flow you should use for every business review your CSMs do, for every time your salespeople get engaged during the contract, because you do know customers are going to leave, or excuse me, people are going to change jobs, right? Like people are going to leave companies and your original decision makers are going to move on. What you want to make sure you're doing throughout this is, one, documenting results. So it shows that there's an existing relationship that's already in place. And so what I'm saying is you want to do this before the change is made and have done it often enough that when the change gets made, you're reinforcing still existing status quo bias. So you want to document results of what you've been doing for them. The framework to do that is probably a bit complicated to get into here, but what I'd say is where a lot of customer success falls down is when they look at the metrics that they track for customers. They're very low level, not executive level metrics. And so when you're tracking things like adoption and utilization and problem fixing, that's not what an executive cares about. Actually, an executive cares about Are you helping me to increase revenue? Are you helping me to decrease costs? Are you helping me to improve throughput, right? They care about those level of things. And what we find is customer success today does a poor job of actually at the launch phase with a customer, understanding what is it that you actually hoped to achieve with this product or the solution, and then continuing to then reconnect with that. So as an example, what we teach and what we think needs to happen and what we've seen be successful is something called the triple metric. And the triple metric is a way at launch to sort of protect yourself against that person eventually leaving, that executive. When you're in that meeting, what you're trying to do is find out what their goals are at the project level, at the department level, and at the corporate level, and how these things all feed into each other. And then once you do that, when you get back to, when you're talking with that executive, your next business review, they're more likely to show up, and you're going to be able to communicate, here's the results that you were asking for, and here's how we've helped contribute to them. When you can do that, and you have that as part of your regular cadence, what happens, and again, I'm not talking about adoption and utilization, I'm talking about the higher level goals. When you do that, what we've seen is that even if that executive leaves, the new executive who comes in, who's often been brought in with a mandate for change, when they start looking down the line items of things they could potentially change, and they hit whatever it is that you're providing, when they say, what about this? Actually, the people around the organization already understand how you've been helping them achieve their higher goals. And because they understand how you've been helping them achieve their higher goals, the conversation isn't about, well, this is such a big line item, we need to make a change. It's, yeah, we need change, but just not here, because this is working for us. So that might have been a bit of a long explanation, but the reality is, if you do the right thing in the launch phase, what you do is set up your messaging throughout that gets you executive level visibility. And when you have that executive level visibility, what our studies show is that, in fact, protects you and gives you some insulation against that executive turning over, because organizationally, the company is more aware of what you do in a way that impacts their corporate level goals. So I'm going to pause there. I know that was a lot, John, but does that make sense?
Yeah, it sure does. And I think, from the HighSpot perspective on this, one of the big shifts that we're seeing and helping to participate in is the job of sales enablement here. If you think about the framework on the why stay that you just articulated, in the old world, we would do, the equivalent of that for a seller. It would be, why do anything? Why do it with us? Why now? And sales enablement teams are now taking on the charter and responsibility to enable their services personnel, to enable their customer success teams. That's as important as anything else, and it drives that top line metric that you're talking about that the executive cares about: retention, net new revenue, and customer delight.
Yep. All right, just trying to be sensitive to time here as we're going along in this. I would like to go back to where we were. So what I'd say is, around this idea of customer success emerging as a growth engine, to us, the core thing you have to do from a sales enablement side is teach your CS people how to communicate value. If you can do that, then that engine you've created can go a lot further. By the way, I'd forgotten to mention, but the results of the poll is 2/3 of you already have a dedicated customer success engine. So again, this is an exploding field. The next one we were going to talk about is the fact that remote selling is starting to replace face-to-face. And John, are you okay if I just give a couple of data points for context for the folks out there? What we're seeing?
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. So here's what we're seeing along those lines. The first is that, just as a starting point, there's 5.7 million sales professionals in the US today. If you look at how they're divided up between inside and outside sales, in remote selling, I just want to say it just means not face-to-face. So this is a version of remote selling, actually, although we're not selling anything, but dealing not face-to-face with people. A study that was done in 2018 by InsideSales.com showed that almost 50% of all selling in B2B complex sales today is done remotely over the phone. And the other half is done with outside sales. But the trends have been, for a long time, more and more of what was outside sales is now going to inside sales, and those teams are increasing. But what's also interesting is when you look at outside sales specifically and look at how much of their selling is done remotely. So the idea when you think of outside sellers is, hey, they should be getting face-to-face with customers. And what you'll hear is they're trying, but the reality is, and this was as of 2018, so this number has changed even more. What we see is that right now, outside salespeople are spending almost 50% of their time selling remotely. And that's been an 89% increase since 2013, which gets to the sort of the final big point here, which is 75% of all sales conversations, when you take what's happening in inside sales and how much of what is supposed to be face-to-face sales is happening remotely, that means 75% of your sales conversations are actually virtual, not face-to-face. And the challenge in that is in most organizations, what they've really built their muscle motion around is how do I equip somebody for a great face-to-face conversation, not for a great virtual conversation. So I want to pause there for a second. And John, what are your thoughts? Is this consistent with what you guys are seeing out there?
I think it is. I mean, one grain of salt, I was reminded in dealing with a vertical prospect recently where there's still a very heavy motion of that face-to-face selling imperative. And we always, I think, have to keep a close eye on that. But there's very clearly the shift to having towards the inside. And I think, kind of what we're seeing here is that if you're inside or outside, an absolute imperative is how do we get that person ready for the customer interaction, either face-to-face or digitally. And I think what alarms us is that even in the year 2019, these sellers are spending between 4 to 15 hours of their week trying to get prepared for that customer interaction, respond to that RFI, come across as that trusted advisor. That's too much time not focused on the customer, and they're dealing with buyers that are dramatically more educated than they were 6, 10, 15 years ago. If you just think about the buying experience of a TV set now versus 15 years ago, it's absolutely night and day because we have access to reams of online reviews and Amazon scores, and everything is curated for us. So if you did even go into a store to buy a TV set, that salesperson, inside or outside, better have value above and beyond the research that I've conducted myself. So I think that's an imperative to have, a mechanism at your organization to prepare that person to provide value up and above and beyond and on top of that. And I think, one of the things that you and I spoke about the other week, Eric, was, okay, let's look at that shift to inside. What's the role of technology now? And one of the things that comes up a lot is the imperative of coaching and helping people be at their best. And we now live in a world where all of those calls that the inside salespeople are making can be recorded. We can do AI to do pattern matching on top of that. Not only do the one-on-one coaching, where a frontline manager is coaching that inside salesperson, hey, here's how to handle that objection even more effectively. Or maybe you've got those 2 or 3 rock stars who are amazing. That call is recorded and they can listen to it on their way to work. But you can look at it in the macro sense. How's my entire sales organization doing at handling these patterns of objections, competitive issues? Are we really selling value, or are we just stuck selling features and product value? So this shift is happening. We're pretty excited about it because I think the way that technology plus framework can help change the game is pretty dramatic.
Yeah, and I would agree. And in fact, I would say that, one of the things that's been one of the things that's helpful that comes out of more sales conversations being virtual is there's more that can be recorded. And so you no longer have to guess what your salespeople are actually doing. You can, in fact, listen, you can hear it, you can see patterns you couldn't see before. All those things are vital and important. What I would,
and by the way, Eric,
yeah, go ahead.
There's a buyer advantage here too, which is I bet you 90% of recorded inside sales calls, the prospect or buyer says, "Hey, could I have the recording as well? Because I want to replay this, I want to listen to it, I want to play it back to the people on my team that weren't there." So it's a win-win all the way across the board. Go ahead.
That's a great point. Also, by the way, there's a second poll that we want to do here, which is, so you just heard the stats around how many sales conversations are happening remotely today, so virtual or not in person. But we'd like to hear from you guys. What is your experience when you think about all of your sales organization? What percentage of your sales conversations are happening remotely? And so, yeah, it's interesting as you see the numbers come in. So we'll give it another second here, John, but it looks like quite a lot are happening remotely nowadays. So yeah, no, the poll's closed at this point. Thanks for chiming in, folks. So the majority, 43%, say 50 to 75% of the time that the sales conversation is taking place in some kind of remote way. And so what I would say is, yes, it gets to coaching, it gets to frameworks. And what we've been spending the last couple of years studying is what makes for a brilliant or best virtual sales conversation. How does it look and how is it different? And what we've learned is that it's actually quite different. You can't just take the stuff that you use to enable your field sales people to enable your remote sales people. You need to take a different approach than that. And again, that research is forthcoming, and you'll get to, for those of you who do choose to grab the ebook that we'll make available to you after this, we get into what some of those frameworks look like, but certainly it's a big trend and we're seeing it all over the place. So I'm gonna, again, just out of respect for time and where we are on all of this, I would say what our sort of overall thinking is on this is you really should be trying to enable remote selling first. That's how we think about it. Instead of last. It's sort of the thing that gets enabled last in a lot of organizations today, and that needs to change. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the convergence of sales and marketing. So one of the things we're seeing is this big move to, in our opinion, John, it no longer makes sense to talk about aligning sales and marketing. Alignment is fine, but alignment really implies sort of what I would consider an old model, which is marketing gets leads and then hands them off to sales, and then sales takes it to the end. And that's really the only connection between sales and marketing, is that handoff point. And what we see is something very different. And in fact, what we see is more of a balance between sales and marketing than there used to be in the past. What I can tell you is, if you look at the data over the last 3 years, what you would see is that if you look at total company spend of their budget on sales and marketing against revenue, it's averaged about 24% total sales and marketing spend of revenue for the last 3 to 5 years. That's been consistent. What has shifted is it used to be that sales got the bulk of that and marketing only got a small percentage of that in the way the split happened. But over the last 3 years, we've seen an increasing move of budgets from sales to marketing. And so it's really been a material shift. And I would say what we're seeing is a shift in power as well. So I would say that one of the most interesting classes I ever took in college was something called the political economy of corporations, which does not sound interesting at all, but actually, in fact, was very interesting to me. And what was interesting about it is they'd say that in organizations, the powerful get money and those who are not powerful get rhetoric. They get told how great they are, but the ones who actually have power get money. And what we're seeing is a shift. It's not that marketing is now more powerful than sales. It's just that the balance is a lot more even than it used to be. And we think it reflects the fact that they really can't be viewed as separate entities anymore. They've come so tightly together to address customer challenges that we don't see really meaningful separation between sales and marketing. So I'm curious as to what you guys are seeing there at Highspot.
There's a very clear trend here, Eric, and what changes everything, I think, is the subscription economy model. Customers can hire and fire any of us at will in the subscription model, and so what you need then is, I would propose 3 core elements, like how do these sales and marketing organizations work together in the new way, in the new economic model. And I'll just start, like my notion and what we look at here at Highspot in terms of the customer journey. There's the top of the funnel all the way through consideration. There's the point that they purchase or acquire, hopefully. Then they do the onboarding and they set up those customer success metrics that you were talking about earlier. Then we retain them and we expand them. And so what do companies need to have? How does sales and marketing need to work in this new world? I'll speak to 2 technology things that I think are important and 1 methodology area that's important. 1, at the base level, you need a customer data platform that is your single source of truth. What are the customers, the prospects doing, and is there one source of data that we can all act on together? So sales and marketing leaders know at every step of the journey, where are we? Where's the fall off happening? How can we improve? How do we delight? 2 is what I call sort of a system of engagement. And, we are engaging across the customer lifecycle, not only as people, but also within the system. And sometimes we're using that technology to augment and engage that. And so at every single step along the journey, how are we creating moments of delight through technology that really surprise our prospects or customers as they are? And then at the top of that sort of that methodology or framework is, are your sales and marketing leaders aligned at a goal and metric level? People sometimes are kind of aligned, like, yeah, we need to make this much money next year and we're going to go do it, rah, rah. But the world of the sales leader is, I need to win these 25 deals this week or this quarter, or hit this number this quarter. And the world of the marketer sometimes is thinking, I need to go out and generate this many NQLs, this many leads. But if you get very precise on aligned metrics that are much more specific across the customer journey, and then you align on not only the strategy at every step of the journey about how sales and marketing partner on that, but the very specific actions that the people that are on the front line and making this happen, the sellers and the customer success people, that's where the magic happens. And by the way, that piece falls down too often between sales and marketing, but just in the last maybe year or so, we are seeing a very big shift as people stop talking about sales and marketing and they're talking about the revenue team, or they're talking about the growth team. And that growth team is sales, marketing, and enablement partnering together to figure out how do we elevate that customer interaction at every step of the journey. So this is absolutely huge to us.
Yeah, and so I'd like to add to that one other place where we think there needs to be alignment between sales and marketing, because they do have different tasks in the mix. And I would say sales and marketing and customer success. But what we found is, again, given our research around how people frame value and make choices, it's caused us to take a look at sort of that way you primarily interact with customers in helping people think about, well, how should we do that? So I'm gonna pull up something really quick so that I can speak to it. And this is, some people might be familiar with this, something like this, customer buying journey. What I'd say is different about us and what our frameworks and what our research experiences showed us is that rather than calling it a buying journey, it's actually more realistic and more accurate to call it a deciding journey. Literally, what is going on in people's brains and in organizations when they're trying to make a decision to do something different and start working with you. And what we find is this is a framework that can be very powerful for aligning both customer success, sales, and marketing if they all see things with a similar framework. So from our viewpoint, what we've seen through the research is when people are happy with their status quo, this won't be a surprise to many. You have to answer the question, why change? That means your marketing materials need to support that and align with that. That means what's coming out of your salespeople's mouths needs to align with it. And then it needs to get to why you, but then as it moves up the chain and you've got people who are saying, yes, we like this company, we like these people, it often then has to go to an executive buyer. In fact, what the statistics show is that 88% of all buying decisions over 50K right now require director level sign off in an organization. So then what sales people in marketing need to do is be able to answer a different question that's happening in the buyer's mind. In this case, it's an executive, and you have to answer the question, why invest? What's the ROI I can get from it? And then why now? What's interesting about the why now question is it's important because you may have won, you may have been selected by the team that was put in place by this executive, but she might know she's got other priorities that need to happen before that she decides which one actually gets funded this quarter. And then there's other questions like, why should they buy pay? Why should we actually close this off? And then also answering the questions for customers who become customers who actually buy, why stay and why evolve? So what we found is that if you want to bring together sales and marketing more effectively, certainly at the goal level, you want to bring it together, but also at the, what are the questions that are going in the buyer's mind that we need to answer as a group, knowing that customers today don't just stick with salespeople throughout a buy cycle. They continually hit websites and other digital information, and that needs to be aligned with what's coming out of the salespeople's mouths. So that's a big trend that we're seeing is, one, there is this convergence where these things are coming together, but two, they need a framework for even how to think about what are we trying to accomplish at each stage. So anyways, any further thoughts on that? John?
I had two thoughts as you were going through that framework, Eric. One was, as you go through it, how are we personalizing it for the prospect or the customer? Because personalized interactions have more impact.
Yep.
The second thought I had was, it's one thing for sales, marketing, customer success, and your enablement team to really sketch out this customer deciding journey. Mm-hmm. But how frequently do the leaders of those teams come back and inspect, are we actually doing this? And then how do we know whether or not we're actually doing what we said we were going to do at each one of these steps? So that you're always iterating, course correcting, fine tuning, and improving the system. And that's something that is often a missing piece, I think, in holding a lot of companies back, and a huge opportunity.
Yep, I agree. All right, just for the sake of time, I'd like to make sure that we get on to this sort of last piece. And, you know, this says sales training adapts to the speed of business. I'm gonna change that, because I think really what we're talking about is sales enablement, adapting to the speed of business. And what I'd say that we've seen over time is that companies plans and desires that they used to be able to put in place, say, hey, we're heading into a new year. We need to look at, what are our objectives by quarter? What kind of enablement do we need for the sales team against each one of those goals for those quarters so that we can be successful? That planning that happens during the budget process almost never survives contact with reality. What we're seeing out there is that business is changing at such a fast rate that, in fact, it's building a program-centric approach over the course of a year is no longer working in organizations. And why? It's because things happen. Like your organization might have a plan, but then they do an acquisition. And now they've done an acquisition, now everything needs to change. Or recently we had with a customer, a Fortune 50 customer who was heading into their most important quarter of the year and suddenly had to respond to a very aggressive competitive threat. A threat so aggressive that they needed to find a way to prepare their salespeople for it, which for them was 4,000 salespeople around the world, and they had to get it done in 6 weeks. And so what we've seen is this world where we believe that sales enablement can no longer look at, here's my programs and this is how things are going to unfold over the next year, and instead need to look at, how can I build a capacity and a capability to be able to execute at speed without knowing ahead of time where I'm going to need to execute. And so that's what we see as the sort of the core challenge for sales enablement now, is actually executing at the speed of change happening in your business. And I'm curious if you guys have seen that as well, and what thoughts you might have.
Yeah, I think we're at an inflection point where, maybe one of the things we did in the past was to think about the speed of business. We would, as an enablement teams or organizations, deliver our salespeople sales plays. And a sales play could be, here's how to handle an objection, here's a conversation starter, here's a new product capability or a cross-sell or a retention motion. And the second that those sales plays were created, to your point, they're often out of date. Competitive issues, new acquisitions, people change, etc. And what we have to do now is have a dynamic system that allows you to create plays that are, real time at the moment of action when your customer facing personnel need it. That's a combination of training, it's the right guidance, it's having stuff that works. And you have to be able to measure that it works. So if you design a sales play for, let's say, customer retention or upsell, were the right people in the room to create that? Was there somebody on the front line who could really validate that it was the right winning play? And then can you measure the effectiveness daily, weekly, monthly, so you can adjust and iterate it as needed? Because that's the speed of business that I think everybody is facing today. And that's where I think, you need a marriage of the framework, the methodology, the people, and a system that can dynamically track and measure the metrics of those sales plays. And one plug for one of a really unsung hero in many cases, that sales enablement leader at your organization, we really think is the tip of the spear or the center that can pull those subject matter experts together so that your sellers are getting the enablement they need at the moment that they need it. So I'll pause there and hand it back to you, Eric.
Thanks. So we'd agree. We think that it has to be driven out of sales enablement to get this all done. We think that there's different ways to scale it as well. So one of the things that we've spent a lot of energy and effort on is, how do you make something work in a world where you need to operate at speed? And in a world where, frankly, people are not trained as much as you'd want them to be. In fact, we did a an industry study that I think speaks to all this. 79% of companies believe they aren't providing enough training to their salespeople. So that's a lot, right? So why aren't they? Well, over half of them say they're struggling with this challenge because of the pressure not to lose time out of field. And so the question becomes, how do you respond to that? And there's a number of different ways, but there is one thing that we've been testing that has produced some exciting results. We've, the model that you might use to try and make this work is a virtual training model. We've spent the last 2 years testing and developing a new type of model that we call inline training. But what's interesting about it is the results, because you might say, well, okay, yeah, do virtual training. That's a way to make things work. And companies plan to invest, their 65% plan to increase investment in virtual training. There is one problem. Only 10% of companies believe virtual training is as good as live or instructor-led classroom events when it comes to behavior change. So the question becomes, what do you do about that? What I'd like to share is there is hope. We recently, over the last 2 years, put a large group in a Fortune 250 software company through a controlled trial of both virtual and live training. What was interesting is when we looked at the results, and these are provided by their data scientists, is what they found is that they actually had an increase in confidence for the people who did the virtual versus the live. And we believe that's because of the model. What we've done is we've paired asynchronous self-paced training and learning with asynchronous video coaching, meaning I take some learning and I get it when I can against my schedule, and then I record a video of myself executing on those skills, and then I get coached by a human who is an expert in this on how did I perform. What's interesting is confidence has gone up in this model, but the versus going into a classroom. But what's also interesting is the actual impact. So that was from 1.5 years ago, when you can just see the results immediately after in terms of confidence. But what we wanted to track was pipeline creation. And what we saw is actually the virtual here produced even more pipeline, the people who went through that, and that was a group of 40, than the 40 who went through the classroom training. And both produced a ton more than those who were untrained. And then the real test is around annual contract value. What were the actual closed deals that came out of it? And again, in this case, what you see is both the virtual and classroom performed about the same. So no sacrifice. So that belief that it can't perform as well actually isn't accurate. And so there's a model for it. It'll be in the ebook. I'm sorry, we are running out of time, so I won't be able to get to all of it. But I guess the point is this: we need to find a way, and Sales Enablement needs to find a way to take advantage of the power of scaling of virtual. It used to be believed that there's no way to make it better, but we believe it is. And by the way, what I'm talking about is a model. You don't have to use our stuff to do it, but what you can use is the model we've created with your own people. So what I'd like to do now is just, I imagine there's been some questions that have come up in chat. And so I'd like to turn things back over to Steve Jones, our moderator, and say, Steve, are there what questions have come up, or please ask them, folks, as you have them. And Steve,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you, Eric. First question is, and Eric, the first question we're getting is, how do we get the ebook? So if we could throw that slide up there, that'd be fantastic. Yep. So people can see how they can attain the ebook. First question here is, your White Stay framework looks heavy towards it will be tough for you to throw us out, and light on look at the big transformations you made and can continue to make with us. It seems a bit defensive.
So that's I appreciate that question. So So what you were seeing were the bubbles. Inside those bubbles are various actions that you take. It's actually not defensive at all. So the document results, part of what you're documenting is where they were before you started and where they've gotten to with you so far. So actually it starts with a strong claim of how you've done contributing to that organization over time. But it also serves an important part in terms of dealing with the problem of status quo bias. What you want to do is subtly remind people, so you don't go into it in a defensive way, but subtly remind them, look, here's what you were getting before you started working with us. Here's what you're getting now. You see that transformation. And subtly remind them, by the way, you went through this process of making this decision. It was a good decision. So that's reviewing the process. And the important thing is to make sure we keep moving, because if we don't keep moving right now, we run the risk of disruption if we don't keep that momentum. And of course, there's costs associated with any of that. And so to get you further along these results, here's the things that we have added just since the last time we've talked, and that's detailing the competitive advances. So there's not time enough on this webinar to address the question in a complete way, but you will see it from the ebook and other material that we make available to you post-call. So that's a great question. What else you got, Steve?
All right, next one. So a thought with a question here. So just a thought. If more sales is moving remote and quota attainment in the industry is declining, do you think the loss of nonverbal communications is part of the reason that quota attainment is going down?
Yeah, so I'll take that for a moment, John, if you don't mind. I do. Here's what we can say. What we can say is that the effectiveness of these calls is very much impacted by the fact that it is remote. And what I would tell you and what the science says is the biggest challenge that you face is getting and sustaining attention when you are remote. And that requires you to think differently about the way you put together your messages and materials. And the number one thing I'd say is people think that humans have reduced their attention span. It's not true. What the science shows is that attention spans haven't dropped, but what has increased is the stimulation threshold, is the way scientists say it, that you need to overcome in order to get someone's attention and sustain it. So as a simple thing that you can do differently to help your salespeople be more effective right now is actually increase the visual stimulation that you offer. And so what does that mean? That means actually more slides, that means more movement, and that means creating PowerPoints that don't look like PowerPoint. If you would just take those 3 steps, what you'll do is increase the effectiveness of all of your remote selling calls in a way that's relatively painless for your organization, and it's something you could do today and right now. I know we're running towards the end of time. Do you have a couple more short ones there, Steve?
Yeah, let's see if we can squeeze one more in here. Do you see the same methodologies applying to people who sell services inside a software company?
I do, and so what I would say on that is we work equally with services. Services, by the way, are moving hard towards this customer success and recurring revenue model. One of our largest customers is a Big 4 consulting firm, and they told us their goal is by the end of 2020 to have 30% of their sales be recurring revenue. In other words, multi-year contracts that are renewable, even though they're selling a service and not selling software. So yes, these methodologies apply, and in fact, that's the way the world's going. And I don't know if John, you have other thoughts on that.
No, we see the same thing, and there's a huge shift here towards providing ongoing value over time, and we think that services is key to that, as well as these kinds of frameworks that help position those people in a position to add value all the time and not just a point in time.
Yeah. I wish I had more time with you guys today, and I'm sure John feels the same. It was a lot to cover, and we just touched the tip of the iceberg. But there is going to be a way to get more depth and to learn more. And so, Steve, I'll turn it over to you to wrap things up and help people understand how to do that best.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Eric. And thank you, John, as well. And thank you, really, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If we were unable to get to your question during the webinar, we'll certainly do our best to answer each one individually after the event. So on behalf of Eric, John, and myself, thank you so much for joining us today, and please have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.